It started just like any other day on the busy streets of the city. The sun was shining high in the sky, and the air was filled with the sounds of people going about their lives. Cars honked, people chatted, and somewhere in the distance, a street musician played a cheerful tune on his guitar. Emily Winters stepped onto the sidewalk, her cane tapping gently against the ground, guiding her forward. Beside her, her guide dog, Max, walked confidently. His black fur shone under the sunlight, and his bright, alert eyes scanned everything around him. Max wasn't just any dog, he was Emily's closest companion, her protector, and her guide in a world she couldn't see. To everyone passing by, Emily was just another person trying to make her way through the chaos of city life. Her dark sunglasses and the gentle way she held Max's leash made it clear she was blind. People glanced at her and then looked away, not thinking much about the woman or the dog walking beside her. She seemed quiet, ordinary, nothing about her stood out. But appearances can be misleading. Emily moved with a calmness that most people didn't notice. She seemed small, fragile even, but she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her hand rested lightly on Max's leash, trusting him completely to guide her safely through the crowds. What the people around her didn't know was that there was more to Max than met the eye. Beneath his calm and obedient demeanor was a dog with a history and skills that no one could imagine. As she walked, Emily could hear the world moving all around her. The rhythmic tapping of her cane blended with the sounds of children laughing, a vendor shouting about fresh fruit, and the roar of motorcycles in the distance. She turned her head slightly in the direction of the noise. The motorcycles sounded closer now, their engines loud and rough. Emily couldn't see them, but she could feel the vibrations in the ground through her feet. Max noticed them too. His ears twitched, and his head turned slightly toward the sound. He stayed close to Emily, his step steady and sure. There was no sign of fear in the dog, only alertness. Emily smiled softly and gave Max's leash a small tug. "It's okay, boy," she said in a soothing voice. Max's tail wagged once in response, but he remained focused. The bikers were still some distance away, revving their engines loudly as if trying to show off. Emily didn't pay them much attention. She had walked this route many times before, and she knew how to tune out the city's distractions. But the bikers weren't the only ones watching her. Strangers passed her by without a second glance, yet a few people noticed the small woman and her large dog. Some smiled politely, while others stepped aside to give her room. Emily was used to this. People often underestimated her. They saw her blindness as a weakness, and they assumed she needed help with even the smallest tasks. What they didn't realize was that Emily had been navigating the world on her own for years. She didn't need their pity, she had Max. Max wasn't just a guide dog. He was her partner, her protector, and her friend. And though the people around her couldn't see it, Max was far from ordinary. As Emily and Max continued down the sidewalk, she felt the breeze on her face and listened to the sounds around her. She had always been good at noticing things, small details that most people missed. It was a skill she had developed after losing her sight, a way to make sense of the world. She could tell by the tone of someone's voice if they were happy or frustrated. She could sense when someone was walking too close or moving too fast. These small observations had become second nature to her. Max had his own way of noticing things. His sharp eyes caught every movement, and his ears twitched at the slightest sound. He was trained to keep Emily safe, no matter what. And though he looked like an ordinary guide dog, there was something special about Max, something no one around them could have guessed. The motorcycles were closer now. Emily could feel their vibrations growing stronger through the sidewalk. She adjusted her grip on Max's leash, her step steady and unhurried. She wasn't afraid. She trusted Max completely, and she knew he would guide her safely. To the world around her, Emily was just another blind woman with a guide dog. But she and Max shared a secret, one that no one could see. And soon, that secret would come to light. For now, though, Emily kept walking, her head held high. She didn't need anyone to know who she really was or what Max was capable of. She was content to let the world think she was ordinary, because sometimes, being underestimated was the greatest strength of all. The motorcycles grew louder as they approached, their engines roaring like wild animals let loose in the city. Emily felt the vibrations through the sidewalk as the bikers came closer, the sound bouncing off the buildings around her. She tightened her grip on Max's leash, her other hand holding her cane steady in front of her. To any onlooker, she looked vulnerable, standing there on the sidewalk with her guide dog beside her. The first biker swerved onto the sidewalk, his tires screeching slightly against the concrete. Others followed, their laughter ringing out like a cruel echo in the air. They didn't slow down, weaving their heavy bikes dangerously close to where Emily stood. "Hey, lady," one of them shouted, his voice rough and taunting. "Where do you think you're going? You and your little mutt think you own the sidewalk." Emily stopped walking and froze in place for a moment. She turned her head slightly toward the sound of the biker's voice, her expression calm but focused. She tightened her hold on Max's leash, and her fingers brushed against his fur, finding comfort in his steady presence. Max didn't move. He stood still, his body straight and firm. His head was up, his ears twitching slightly as he listened to the bikers. Another biker joined in, his voice mocking and loud. "Maybe your dog needs glasses too. He can't see where he's going, huh?" The group roared with laughter. Their bikes circled closer, their engines rumbling like thunder. Emily remained where she was, her breathing slow and even. She could feel the tension building, the weight of their presence pressing against her like a storm cloud overhead. Passers-by on the street glanced toward the commotion but didn't stop. Some looked uncomfortable, their faces a mix of worry and embarrassment. A few hesitated as if they might step in, but none of them did. They quickly turned away, pretending not to see, hurrying on with their day. Emily could hear their footsteps fading into the distance. She was alone with the bikers now. The lead biker revved his engine and leaned forward, smirking as he brought his bike to a stop just a few feet in front of her. He tilted his head to the side, his sunglasses reflecting the bright sunlight. "You scared, lady?" he asked, his tone dripping with mock concern. "Don't worry. We won't hurt you, much." Emily didn't respond. She kept her face calm, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't going to give them the reaction they wanted. Inside, her mind was racing, but she knew she had to stay composed. Any sign of fear would only encourage them further. Max, standing at her side, remained quiet. He didn't bark or growl, but his posture was different now. His body was tense, his muscles ready. His sharp eyes locked onto the bikers, watching their every move. The stillness in him was unnerving, but the bikers didn't seem to notice. They were too busy laughing, too caught up in their own game to realize the danger they were standing so close to. The bikers circled her again, their bikes moving like predators closing in on their prey. One of them leaned over as he passed, pretending to reach out toward her. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or is it dog?" he said, laughing at his own joke. His hand came dangerously close to Max's head, but before he could touch him, Max shifted slightly, a small, deliberate movement that made the biker pull back. "Whoa," the biker said, laughing nervously. "Easy, boy. Don't bite me." Emily's grip on Max's leash tightened. She whispered something under her breath, so soft it was almost imperceptible. Only Max could hear her words, and his ears twitched in response. To the bikers, it looked like she was helpless, muttering to her dog for comfort. They couldn't have been more wrong. The leader of the group dismounted from his bike and walked toward her. His heavy boots clunked against the pavement as he approached, a smug grin on his face. He stood in front of her, arms crossed, looking down at her like she was a puzzle he was trying to figure out. "You're not saying much, are you?" he said, his voice low and mocking. "What's the matter? Too scared to talk?" Emily lifted her chin slightly, her expression unchanging. She tilted her head as if listening to him more closely, but she didn't say a word. Instead, she gave a small tug on Max's leash, a subtle signal that only he understood. Max's stance shifted again, just enough to show he was ready for whatever came next. His eyes locked onto the biker, and for the first time, the man seemed to notice something different about the dog. There was an intensity in Max's gaze, something that didn't quite fit the image of an ordinary guide dog. The biker frowned slightly, his confidence wavering for just a moment. "What's with the dog?" he muttered, half to himself. He reached out a hand again, but this time, Max let out a low, rumbling growl. It wasn't loud, but it was deep and deliberate, vibrating through the air like a warning. The biker froze, his hand hanging in the air. The other bikers stopped their laughter, their engines idling as they watched. The leader took a step back, his grin fading. "Relax, lady," he said, trying to sound confident but failing. "We're just having a little fun." Emily finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said softly. The biker blinked, caught off guard by her tone. There was no fear in her voice, no hesitation. For the first time, he seemed to realize that the woman standing in front of him wasn't as helpless as she appeared. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering. Max remained still, his eyes sharp and unblinking, his body coiled like a spring ready to release. The tension in the air was thick, and for the first time, the bikers seemed unsure of what to do next. Emily stood her ground, calm and steady. She wasn't afraid. She knew something the bikers didn't. And soon, they would find out exactly what that was. The bikers weren't done. If anything, their taunts grew louder and bolder with each passing moment. They laughed like it was all a big joke, circling Emily and Max on their roaring bikes. Their engines growled, and the sound bounced off the buildings, making the air feel heavy. Emily stood still, her grip on Max's leash firm. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. Her calmness seemed strange, even out of place, given the situation. Most people might have shouted or begged for help by now. Some might have run. But Emily did none of those things. She didn't panic. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. It was as though she was tuned into a different frequency, one the bikers couldn't understand. The leader of the group sneered, his helmet tilted back on his head. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or is it the dog?" His laugh was sharp, cutting through the noise of the street. The others joined in, their voices loud and mocking. Max, however, didn't react to their words. He stood at Emily's side, but there was a change in him now. It was subtle, something most people wouldn't notice. His body, which had been relaxed before, was now firm and deliberate. His legs planted firmly on the ground, his tail no longer wagging. His ears twitched at every sound, picking up even the faintest noise. His sharp eyes locked onto the group, following every movement. One of the bikers dismounted from his bike, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He took a step toward Emily, his face twisted into a smug grin. "Relax, lady," he said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "We're just having a little fun. No need to be so uptight." Max's eyes shifted to the man, his gaze steady and unblinking. The biker didn't notice at first, too busy showing off for his friends. He took another step forward, his hand reaching out like he was going to pat Max on the head. That's when it happened. Max let out a growl. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was so soft that it might have gone unnoticed by someone not paying attention. But there was something about it, something deep and deliberate. It was the kind of sound that made you stop in your tracks. And that's exactly what the biker did. His hand froze mid-air, his grin faltering. "Whoa," he said, his voice quieter now. He looked at Max for the first time, really looked at him, and something in his posture changed. The dog's stillness, his sharp eyes, the low growl, it all added up to something that didn't feel quite right. The other bikers noticed, too. Their laughter quieted, replaced by a murmur of confusion. "What's with the dog?" one of them asked, frowning. Emily finally spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, and almost too quiet for the chaos around her. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said. Her words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. The biker who had been reaching out took a step back, his confidence clearly shaken. "What's the big deal?" he muttered, trying to sound tough but failing. "It's just a dog." Max didn't move. He didn't bark or snap. But his eyes stayed locked on the man, and his growl, though quiet, didn't stop. It was a warning, clear and unmistakable. The biker's friends started to shift nervously on their bikes, their engines idling as they watched. "You're making a big mistake," Emily said, her voice still even. She wasn't raising it, wasn't shouting, but there was something in her tone that made the words feel heavy, almost like a promise. The lead biker didn't like the shift in power. He stepped forward, glaring at Emily. "Are you threatening us?" he asked, his voice louder now, trying to regain control. "You think your dog is gonna scare us off?" Emily didn't answer. She stood still, her head slightly tilted, her grip on Max's leash firm but calm. Max stayed at her side, unmoving, his focus unbroken. The tension in the air grew thicker, almost suffocating. The biker who had dismounted looked back at his friends, unsure. "Maybe we should just go," he muttered under his breath. But the leader shook his head. He wasn't ready to back down. His pride was on the line now, and he wasn't about to let some blind woman and her dog make him look weak. "Get out of here," he snapped at Emily, pointing a finger at her. "Go home before you get hurt." Emily didn't budge. Her calmness was almost eerie now, like she knew something they didn't. And she did. The bikers didn't know who Max was. They didn't know about his training, his history. To them, he was just a guide dog, a helper for a blind woman. But Max was so much more than that. Beneath his calm exterior was a highly trained protector, a dog who had spent years in service, learning skills that no ordinary animal could master. Emily knew what Max was capable of. She trusted him completely. And as the bikers continued their taunts, she felt no fear. She knew Max was watching, waiting, ready to act if he needed to. The leader took another step forward, his frustration growing. "Fine," he said, his voice low and angry. "Let's see what your dog can do." Max shifted slightly, his muscles tensing. Emily could feel it through the leash, the way his body coiled like a spring, ready to release at any moment. But she gave him a small signal, a slight tug on the leash, and Max stayed where he was. For now. The bikers hesitated, their confidence cracking as they took in the scene. Something about the dog, the way he stood, the way he watched them, made them uneasy. They didn't know why, but they could feel it. This wasn't a fight they were going to win. Emily tilted her head again, her calmness unshaken. "You should leave," she said simply. The leader glared at her, his fists clenched. But something in her tone, in the dog's quiet growl, made him pause. He looked at Max again, and for the first time, he saw not just a dog but a force he didn't understand. The moment stretched on, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, slowly, the leader stepped back. "Let's go," he said, his voice gruff. One by one, the bikers turned their bikes around. The roar of their engines filled the air as they sped off, their laughter replaced by silence. Emily stood still until the sound of the bikes faded completely. Then she reached down and stroked Max's head, her hand gentle and reassuring. "Good boy," she said softly. Max's tail wagged once, but his eyes stayed sharp, scanning the street for any remaining threat. Emily smiled faintly, her composure unbroken. She and Max turned and continued down the sidewalk as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The biker smirked, his nervous laughter barely covering his uncertainty. "What's the mutt gonna do, huh?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. He glanced back at his friends, searching for support, but even they looked uneasy now. Still, the biker moved forward, too proud to back down. But he didn't get the chance to do anything more. In an instant, Max moved. It was so fast that it was hard to follow. One moment, he was standing calmly by Emily's side, the next, he was between her and the biker, his body low and tense, ready for action. His movements were sharp and deliberate, and for the first time, the biker hesitated. Max's posture was unlike anything the bikers had ever seen in a dog. He didn't bark, didn't growl. Instead, he stood tall, his gaze locked on the biker. There was something commanding about him, something that demanded respect and fear. The biker froze, his smirk gone. He stepped back slightly, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Easy, boy," he muttered, trying to sound calm, but his voice wavered. "I was just joking, okay." Then it happened. From behind a nearby lamppost, two men in dark suits appeared. Their movements were quick and purposeful, their expression serious. They didn't speak as they approached, but their presence was enough to make the bikers stop in their tracks. Moments later, more men and women in suits emerged from a parked van across the street. They moved swiftly, surrounding the area. The street, once filled with laughter and taunts, fell silent. "Stand down," one of the agents said firmly, his voice carrying authority. But he wasn't talking to the bikers. His eyes were on Max. Max didn't need to be told twice. He took a single step back, his body relaxing slightly, but his focus on the group didn't waver. He was calm but ready, his sharp eyes still watching every move the bikers made. What is this?" one of the bikers stammered, his bravado gone. He looked around wildly at the agents, his face pale. "Who are you people?" Another agent stepped forward, his gaze cool and unyielding. "Step away from the woman," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. The bikers, now visibly shaken, obeyed without hesitation, their earlier arrogance completely gone. The lead biker turned to Emily, confusion and fear written all over his face. Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily, who had been calm and silent throughout the ordeal, finally allowed herself a small smile. She reached down and placed a hand on Max's head, her fingers gently stroking his fur. "You wanted to know what my dog could do," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with quiet confidence. "Meet Max, former presidential security K-9. The bikers stared at her, their mouths open in disbelief. Emily continued, her tone even but firm. "He's retired now, but his training isn't something he's forgotten. And neither have I." The weight of her words hung in the air. The bikers exchanged nervous glances, their fear now fully realized. This wasn't just any dog, and Emily wasn't just any blind woman. They had underestimated her and now they were paying the price. The agents began to close in, their movements efficient and calculated. One of them spoke into a small device clipped to his jacket, giving instructions that Emily couldn't hear. But she didn't need to. She knew what was happening. The bikers were being dealt with, and they wouldn't bother her or anyone else again. As the agents led the bikers away, Emily remained where she was, her hand still resting on Max's head. She didn't say anything more. There was no need. The bikers had learned their lesson, and the truth about Max had been revealed. For a moment, the street was quiet again. The tension had passed, replaced by a sense of calm. Emily gave Max a small pat on the head. "Good boy," she said softly. Max wagged his tail once, a small but happy gesture. Then, just like that, the two of them turned and continued down the sidewalk, as if nothing had happened. Behind them, the agents cleaned up the scene, and the bikers were taken away. But the memory of what had just happened would linger. Emily and Max had shown them and everyone else that appearances could be deceiving. Sometimes, the most unassuming people and the quietest protectors carried the greatest strength. The street was quiet now, a sharp contrast to the loud chaos from just minutes before. The roaring engines of the bikers' motorcycles were silenced. The once boisterous group of bikers now stood handcuffed, their heads hanging low. They avoided looking at anyone, their earlier arrogance replaced with shame and fear. Agents led them toward waiting police cars, their protests weak and half-hearted. One biker, who had been the loudest of them all, glanced over his shoulder at Emily and Max. His eyes were wide with disbelief, as if he still couldn't understand how things had turned out this way. But he didn't say a word. No one did. Emily stood quietly on the sidewalk, her cane in one hand and Max's leash in the other. Her face was calm, but there was a quiet strength in her expression. Max stood by her side, his body relaxed now that the danger had passed. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with loyalty and trust. An agent in a dark suit approached her, his demeanor professional but kind. "Ma'am," he said softly, "thank you for your cooperation. You handled that remarkably well." Emily smiled faintly, tilting her head slightly toward the agent. "Max deserves the credit," she said, reaching down to stroke the dog's head. Max wagged his tail, the motion small but full of meaning. The agent nodded. "He's impressive. Honestly, ma'am, with skills like his, you could easily have him reinstated. Are you sure you don't want to consider it? A dog like Max is a rare asset." Emily chuckled softly, crouching down so she could be at Max's level. She ran her fingers through his fur, her touch gentle and affectionate. "He's earned his retirement," she said firmly. "He's been through enough. But," she added with a smile, "it's nice to know he's still watching out for me." Max let out a soft huff, as if agreeing with her. Emily scratched behind his ears, and his tail wagged again. As the agents continued their work, the small crowd that had gathered began to disperse. People who had watched the scene unfold were now murmuring to each other in hushed tones. Their whispers carried a mix of curiosity, admiration, and awe. "She's not just a blind woman," one man said to his friend, shaking his head in disbelief. "Did you see how calm she was? And that dog, he's incredible." A woman nearby nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I didn't even realize what was happening at first," she admitted. But she didn't seem scared at all. She knew exactly what she was doing. Another voice chimed in, quieter but full of respect. "You don't see people like her every day. She's something else." Emily could hear bits and pieces of the conversations around her. She didn't react, but she felt their words. People who had walked by earlier, too busy or disinterested to help, now looked at her with newfound respect. The same strangers who had ignored her before now saw her in a different light. The agents finished their work quickly, ensuring that the bikers were taken away without any further trouble. One of them turned to Emily before leaving and tipped his head in a small gesture of respect. "Thank you, ma'am. You and Max did a great job." Emily nodded politely, her hand still resting on Max's head. "Thank you," she replied simply. As the last police car drove away and the agents disappeared, the street returned to normal. People went back to their routines, the earlier drama already becoming a story to share later. But for those who had witnessed it, the memory of the blind woman and her extraordinary dog would linger. Emily adjusted her grip on Max's leash and gave him a gentle nudge. "Ready to go, Max?" she asked. Max wagged his tail, his body language light and happy now that the tension was gone. Together, they began to walk down the sidewalk, just as they had before. To anyone watching, they looked like an ordinary woman and her guide dog. But those who knew the truth understood they were anything but ordinary. As they walked, Emily felt a small smile tugging at her lips. She didn't need the crowd's admiration or their respect. She didn't need them to know who she was or what Max could do. She and Max had done what they always did. They had faced a challenge, stayed calm, and come out stronger on the other side. Emily walked slowly down the sidewalk, her cane tapping lightly against the pavement. Each step was steady, her movements calm and measured. Beside her, Max trotted faithfully, his tail swaying gently with every